Hello, I'm Anita Bennett, and this is LA Currents. Last summer, Los Angeles, like so many other cities, saw massive crowds take to the streets demanding racial justice. The catalyst for that call for change was the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Now, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti listened, and he appointed the city's first ever chief equity officer. The woman who took on that role is Brenda Shockley, the city's deputy mayor for economic opportunity. She is with us today to discuss LA's Racial Equity Action Plan. Ms. Shockley, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you for having me.
So what is the city's action plan?
Well, the city's action plan is rooted in the mayor's Executive Directive 27, which was issued after and during the wake of the demonstrations around the George Floyd killing. The racial equity in city government is really what the executive directive focuses on. However, it also looks at the services, the service delivery to the residents of the city of Los Angeles, and whether or not some groups are receiving better or more service than others, as well as the contracting, where the city spends well over $1 billion in vendor contracts, and the number of contracts, or the amount of contracts made to organizations and businesses of color have been identified as really almost de minimis in terms of the amount of money that the city is spending. So the mayor's Executive Directive 27 addresses the recruitment into city government, the hiring, the retention, and the promotion. And we work closely with the personnel department. Every city department had, pursuant to Executive Directive 27, to prepare a racial equity plan by last September. The executive directive was issued on Juneteenth, as we in the African American community refer to June 19th, and it was very symbolic because Juneteenth actually is very much tied to how some years later, some years after the end of slavery, legally, that people in certain parts of Texas did not even know. So that's the significance of Juneteenth, and it was particularly significant in the wake of the George Floyd killing that the mayor and the city of Los Angeles take a position, an intentional position around racial and social justice.
So let's talk a little bit about city hiring. I mean, I know you said the personnel department is involved, but how do you bring more equity to city hiring? Do you specifically recruit certain groups, or how does that work?
Well, actually, and I think you're well aware that the state of California is subject to what was Proposition 209, so that it really prevents the ability to do really sort of quote-unquote race-motivated programs and policies. And the city charter was amended to be in compliance with 209. One of the things that's become very evident in those years since, and Proposition 16 did not pass, it was on the November ballot, and there was hope that it would pass, that it would make it a lot simpler to right some of these historic wrongs. However, it didn't pass, and so now the city still has the capacity, because if you look at all the social indicators, African Americans, indigenous people, people of color are overrepresented in the most, what we would regard as the negative indicators, and dramatically underrepresented in the, quote, positive indicators. One of the best ones being the gap in family wealth, the comparison not only of African Americans, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islanders, and whites, that African Americans and Latinos, but African Americans particularly, have just barely a fraction of the family worth and wealth that Asian Americans, Asian Pacific Island Americans, as well as white Americans. That tells you a lot. And we can really, a lot of it when we looked at full employment, just in a year and a half ago. Full employment at 4%, you still had African American, particularly male unemployment, being in double digits. Yeah. So there are enough really social indicators to allow the city to develop programs that have to do less with race on its face, but if you address poverty and you address unemployment and you address mass incarceration and you address some of the other issues, the social ills, you will in fact, the city will in fact still really have a much better representation of African American, indigenous people, other peoples of color.
Okay, that makes sense. And in terms of city contracts, what can be done to make that more equitable?
Well, I think that the city process, what happens is that as we use that expression, and it takes on more and more meanings, the quote, usual suspects, in the sense that, as you know, the process to navigate the city, whether it's employment or whether it's contracting, whether it's services, tends to be fairly complex, and it allows those who have the experience to continually obtain the contracts.
Exactly.
That there were efforts in the past, efforts that could be renewed and hopefully will be renewed by the departments as they submit. Each department submits a racial equity plan. Each department identifies, appointed by the general manager, a racial equity officer. Each general manager will have, as part of his or her or their annual review, what progress has been made in these areas in that particular department. So there is the capacity to address it, and Mayor Eric Garcetti has put the political will behind it. And I am confident that the City Council will also, because the disparities are very glaring. Yes. And it's, it's sort of easily simplified that the lower jobs, the jobs that pay less, not so much that they're lower jobs. I mean, you notice all of a sudden we are deeply appreciative of these essential workers.
Yes.
And the recognition, though, that among the management and administration and other parts of some departments are so conspicuously without presence by, at those levels, by African Americans, Latinx, and others. So each department, some doing better than others, if better means a greater diversity, and it does to me, that there will be a sense of equity and fairness. And one of the things, if I can take a little liberty, is to say that equity can be distinguished from equality. Equality is when everyone is, quote unquote, in that context, treated the same. However, equity is about meeting people where they are. It is about fairness, and sometimes, often, being, quote, equal is not being fair.
In my opinion, part of the issue is information. With the city contracts, someone who historically their family or their friends have been involved, they have those contacts. So how do you reach the people who don't have those contacts, who are not aware, business owners, of how city contracts work?
Well, we have an economic and workforce development department, actually one of the departments that I interface with. And Carolyn Hull and her staff, her economic development side of the economic workforce development, are looking at how to broaden that tent. One of the things that's happened in terms of the pandemic is because the city, the mayor was able to raise all that money to assist small businesses, so that now you have a database. We have a database of small businesses that have now had an experience with the city of Los Angeles, and we can build on that. It's no reason that you don't have the webinars or the seminars that address how to do business with the city. There's no reason that you don't show what is a responsive, what's responsive to an RFP and what isn't. That you, for those who have not had been included in the past, that providing them with those tools, that information, as you point out, is critical, because it's timing. The responses are complicated. The documentation that you need is extensive. The ability to be reimbursed and be able to have adequate cash available to do work, all of that is a part of determining whether or not a proposal is responsive to the request and that the business should receive a contract. I think that the other ways is to encourage those general contractors, whether it's construction or leading contractors, whether there's a digital divide or other major infrastructure efforts by the city, that those lead contractors can make an effort and can be acknowledged for including as subcontractors African Americans, indigenous people, other peoples of color. So it has to do with the will, and it has to do with the commitment. And I am encouraged, but I've also lived through any number of different versions of civil unrest, nationally and here locally. And I hope that because there was a verdict already and no violence or civil unrest as a result, that people don't now feel they can just kind of move on. The issue has not been adequately addressed. The issues here in Los Angeles have not been adequately addressed. And there's more to the life experience than when you are violated by the police. Yes. There are any number, countless and sadly, ways that people are devalued and put in positions where they cannot sustain themselves, put in positions where they cannot provide for their families. Those ills must be addressed as well.
You touched on a lot of important topics, the whole thing with generational wealth, and I just wasn't so aware of this until the Bruce's Beach issue came to light recently. So, but addressing these issues, there are critics who will say, well, this is affirmative action that the city is trying to do. So how do you respond to those folks?
Well, I respond in the fact that to those same people, the advantages that you and generations of your family have received as part of the largesse of being an American, that same consideration and the righting of those wrongs, those things that were done to others in order to increase your wealth, that has to be addressed, that has to be corrected. And the biggest issue of generational wealth has to do with home ownership, because therein is a huge divide. Having an African American family with a net wealth of $8 compared to a white family in the same general geographic area having $250,000 in wealth. What is that? That's equity in their homes. How do you have equity in your home? You have a job that allows you to buy a home. How do you do that? You get the education and the training that makes you an exemplary employee. All of this, and that's one of the reasons that I think that President Biden is really headed in the right direction, because it is about family and it is about starting as early as possible.
Absolutely, makes perfect sense to me, but still there are critics. You also touched on the LAPD, police, and there are some other folk who say the LAPD was heavy-handed last summer. So how do we address these issues in the city?
Well, I think you address them the way they're addressing them now. You have a full investigation. And we now, as we've seen, starting with Rodney King, how invaluable the video is.
Yeah.
Because it takes away so much of the he said, she said. And I think that it doesn't necessarily, a video doesn't tell the whole story, but the video certainly addresses where there might have been some, shall we say, stretching of the story.
Yeah.
How long did it take? When did you stop? All of that. And, you know, I don't think it's a mistake that so many of these times when these things happen that are outside of policy, darn it, the camera's not on. So, you know, I think that Chief Moore is sincere. I think that he's walking that line, because anyone who has you want to support your staff, yet at the same time you have a commitment to the public, and that has to be done in a way that is sensitive, that is fair, and that is transparent.
Some funds, millions of dollars, are being diverted from the LAPD into programs to help the community. Can you talk a little bit about that? And when I say community, I mean Black and brown communities.
Yes, I can talk a little bit about it, only because I know that this is all fluid.
Yes.
We are in the middle of budget discussions as we speak. So I'm not, I don't have the last word on anything on that. However, I do know that what you have is a situation where I don't think the police disagree. The police department doesn't disagree with there are a lot of things that they feel they have been forced to do that is not really what their skill set is about, but they're the only ones that are available at that time. I think that the problem is that they don't want to do that, but they don't want to have a smaller budget. But someone has to do it. If you agree it's not appropriate for you to do it, ideally, so then we have to be able to have those who are non-sworn officers who are able to respond. Now, I've worked a lot in the whole area, particularly blacks experiencing homelessness, the ad hoc committee there. And one of the things I've heard over and over is both the police department and the fire department saying at 3 in the morning, we're the only shop that's open. And then we get the call and what this does to us. And I think that what should happen is an increase in the services provided, and that this, quote, civilian response has to be at minimum 24/7. And it also has to have trained professionals that are able to negotiate and to quell.
Counselors.
Yes, counselors, but psychologists, social workers, medical people, because a lot of times you have, particularly in the case of mental illness, you have people that are no longer taking their medication, or you have people who exhibit certain behavior that if you're not trained, is treated as violent and combative. But there are those who know how to handle that situation short of a shooting. And I think that it's certainly worth the effort to see that maybe LAPD can be more sensitive and more targeted in its efforts, because you also have adequately compensated, trained professionals that are dealing and have the skill set that LAPD has acknowledged it doesn't have.
Let's talk a little bit about you. How do you balance being deputy mayor with pushing for racial equity?
Well, for me, it's the same thing. I mean, for me, how are you going to have opportunity without equity? Our shop, the Mayor's Office of Economic Opportunity, we always had equity as part of our mission. And so it really elevated work that was already being done and augmented that work by focusing internally. And I commend the mayor because he started where he lives. And as a result of showing that kind of sort of courage and responsibility, private sector companies have flocked to the city to say, how do we do this? Because on some level, no matter how subtle it is, we all know that the society we're in right now is not sustainable the way it is. It is not going to be resilient when you have large portions of the community and the society not really participating, not able to participate. And I know it affects my quality of life, even though I work and have a job and so forth, to see it. Yeah. Because there is a collective guilt we all share when you see people living on the streets. Everyone may not acknowledge it. Some people prefer not to see it because they would like to stay in that safe place of denial. But if we are going to grow and advance with the challenges we're facing, the challenges that are external to us, with climate change, with pandemic, with all the things we're facing, we as a people and a community, city, family, we have to be able to look out for one another.
Yes.
And to provide for those who are unable to.
Mm-hmm. It's it's heartbreaking, the homeless issue in Los Angeles, and a disproportionate number of them are Black. What can we do as a city?
Well, I think that, and the mayor has said it over and over, we have to have a FEMA level response. You don't do as much as the money allows. You have to do what has to be done and find the money. You have to do what has to be done. And I think that while it certainly created a level of confusion and frustration, Judge Carter's impatience has also helped to remind us all that this is not how we live as Americans.
Yes.
And I can't pretend that the fact that the largest unsheltered population in the United States of America is located steps from here. Mm-hmm. And it is not just happenstance that 90% plus of those unsheltered people on Skid Row are Black.
It will be interesting to see what happens after the judge's order. We face a lot of challenges in that area, but we're running out of time, and I do want to talk a little bit more about you. Before you came to the city, you helped found Community Build. Tell us about that.
Well, yes, that was a very exciting time, but it was also a time where this time after George Floyd, we avoided what was the destruction and the like in 1992 after the verdicts came in and the Rodney King beating, the first time we all could see for ourselves what happened. And I think that had a lot to do with when the verdicts came in, people who were already a tinderbox, people who were already just marginally a part of what was going on, that didn't have any sense of hope, didn't have any real support system, didn't have the training, didn't have the education. Sadly, the only power they had was to destroy. And so Community Bill was created as an particularly African American, but not really that because our programs were for everyone, but it was a South Los Angeles response to the civil unrest. Whereas there were downtown, Peter Uberoff headed Rebuild LA. And that whole by its own title was to bring it back like it was. There were people in the African American community, most vocal being Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who's like, no, we're not going back. That's what got us here. And so she convened a group of African American organizations, banks, financial institutions to say, do you want to become a committee that rebuilds LA from the African American point of view like they have downtown? Mm-hmm. Or do you want to start your own organization where we focus on what we believe is important? And it was it was unanimous that those times called for a response that was particularly directed at what happened at what was then Florence and Normandy. Mm-hmm. And the people, the men that were there, the young people that were out, they had grown up where there was no safety net and there was no training programs like that. We had actually had, by 1992, we'd had, I think, something like 12 years of Republican administrations. And so training programs, education programs, a number of the, quote, support systems in place for people to get what they needed. Mm-hmm. Those things were, it was sort of slowly they had eroded, mm-hmm. and they weren't available. So you had no vocational training and you really didn't have access to a lot of academic training for those who had all these barriers.
Mm-hmm. And Community Build, we should tell people, is a nonprofit. And
yes, community. So out of all of this, we did establish, and it was funded initially by African American organizations. At the time, we had 3 African American banks. They put in funding because it was also, we knew better than if we're going to be about ourselves, we ought to be able to fund ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so we weren't inclined to go and get more. So it ended up that the organizations, the Brotherhood Crusade, the Watts Health Foundation, many of the same organizations that are still working every day in the community.
To bring about change.
To bring about change that we were able, and I was there, it tells a lot when it took every April to tell me how many years I'd been there. And I left after 24 years.
Wow, and they're still doing great work.
They're doing great work. They have a new CEO. First I was away for a year as on leave. Mm-hmm. Then I realized I really did want to stay at the city. So there's a new CEO there, Robert Salcedo. Yep. And they are doing, it's next level for them. And I'm really happy.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here, Deputy Mayor Brenda Shockley, for enlightening us about the city's equity plans, and best of luck.
Well, thank you. And I think if I can just have a moment is just to say it will take all of us, mm-hmm. city family, outside a city family, but it can happen. It can happen if we all recognize that we have to tap into our humanity. And if we only see and only provide to others that which we have, we will be well on the way.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Deputy Mayor Brenda Shockley, and best of luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
I'm Anita Bennett. This is LA Currents. Thank you for watching.